I'm Angelina, 19. 6 months ago, my life felt like a slow, ordinary grief. Dad, Thomas Rivera, got sick, the house got quieter. I learned how to press his shirts and make his coffee the way he liked it, so the little rituals would keep him with me a while longer. Then cancer did what cancer does, and the thing you weren't ready for wasn't just the funeral. It was the speed at which my life rearranged itself around other people's comforts. That's where the stakes come in: school, money, dignity. Everything that could keep me from becoming another sad statistic was suddenly on the line, and I had to hold it up with my 2 hands. My mom, Maya, changed fast and unrecognizably. One minute, she was a woman who made casseroles for late visitors and left voicemails I could still hear in my head. The next, she was wearing a new name I didn't recognize and answering to Mrs. Reed in a voice that fit a life I didn't get invited into. Colton Reed moved in like he'd been waiting in the doorway of our old life with blueprints and a smile, and then things that had been ours were quietly filed under assets. The house where my dad's tools lived became someone else's office. Maya stopped coming to my games, to parent-teacher meetings, even to the nights I couldn't sleep and called because I couldn't breathe through the silence. They sent me to Chicago, Rita and Harold Jensen's house, like an afterthought. "It'll be better for you," they said, which translates to, "You can be useful and invisible at the same time." Rita is all tight-lipped Christian charity. Harold has the kind of thumbs that have never done a hard day's work, but knows how to make a spreadsheet look like salvation. Their kids, Ethan and Claire, are polished in ways I wasn't allowed to be. Important detail: they started charging me rent while I was still finishing high school, because apparently family charity now comes with an invoice. That rent ate at the few cents of pride I had left. To keep a roof over my head and still go to community college, I worked 2 jobs. Midnight at Harold's laundromat, evening at a gas station 2 blocks from where I slept on bad nights. The laundromat smelled of bleach and eternity. The machines always sounded like the heartbeat of someone who won't quit. On the graveyard shift, I learned how to fold other people's lives into crisp, polite bundles, while my own stayed wrinkled in my back seat. At the gas station, I learned a different kind of humiliation. Men who assumed I was easy, regulars who tipped with gossip, fluorescent lights that made me feel like I was always being looked at under interrogation. Ethan and Claire treated me like I was background noise in a sitcom they didn't want to reboot. They'd walk by the laundromat on weekends and make jokes about working girl lifestyles, linger out front of the gas station to sharpen their laughs. They took pleasure in small cruelties: forgotten chores, snide comments when I tried to eat dinner at the kitchen table, invitations that weren't really invitations. Maya's contributions to my life were equally generous: an occasional text with an emoji and a transfer that looked like pocket change. There was grief, sure, but there was also a deliberate, patient unspooling of every bridge that might get me out of the oldest kind of poverty: reliance on other people who thought I should be grateful for their leftovers. So that's the setup. Me trying to keep one good thing from being swallowed: my future, while everyone who used to be family either disappeared, got a lawyer, or started billing me for oxygen. The stakes weren't dramatic in a movie way. They were braided into the small things: my tuition check, the monthly bus pass, whether I could afford a textbook that might actually make a difference. I was holding on by the rawness of habit and the stubborn math of work shifts, and I hated every second of needing to any. The rent doubled the month after my aunt found out about a late tuition payment. It was the sort of cruel little punctuation that tells you exactly where you stand in someone else's life. Useful until inconvenient, then charged accordingly. I told myself I'd swallow it and tighten everything else: coffee, hours, pride. But there's only so much rope you can coil around your dignity before it frays. I chose school over rent, so I moved out. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way. No furniture van, no stoic montage. Just me, the passenger seat of a 2008 Camry that had once belonged to my dad, a backpack full of notebooks, a box of the few dishes I owned, and the absolute conviction that a 2-year degree would be my ticket out. The car became a tiny, stubborn universe. Textbooks on the passenger floor, a blanket folded over the back seat, a headlamp for reading at night, the dashboard clock like a metronome counting my attempts at survival. I learned where the coffee shops let you sit after closing, which Walmarts didn't make you show ID to use the bathroom, which 24-hour diners served pie at 3 a.m. with zero judgment. Then Ethan and Claire found out. They made it a series. Little clips, me crawling out to fold laundry at dawn, me brushing my teeth behind a gas station, me crawling back into my car with my backpack like it was a small, sad animal, stitched together with cheap, viral music and captions that called me a drama queen and homeless for clout. The videos caught like kindling. People I'd known in school shared them as jokes. A boy I dated once commented with an emoji and then unliked it when I looked at his profile. The comments were polished cruelty, performative concern, laughing emojis, guesses about my morals. The worst part wasn't even the watching. It was how small I felt under it, less than a person and more like an exhibit. What they didn't know was that Uncle Harold had seen everything long before the phones arrived at the kitchen table. The laundromat has cameras, no big surprise, but Harold watched more than just machines. He watched the parking lot, the alley, the rows of folding chairs. At first, I thought of that as creepy. Someone watching me sleep through a windshield felt like betrayal, but then he started sending people. A delivery driver would leave a thermos on the office steps with a note, "Chicken soup, get warm." A guy from the night shift would casually swing by and offer me quarters or a blanket. The small interventions felt like breadcrumbs leading towards something kinder than voyeurism. One night, after a particularly savage string of videos went up and my chest felt raw from being open to the world, Harold walked me into the small office behind the laundromat. He closed the door, shuffled through a file, and said, plainly, "I knew your dad when he was broke enough to sleep in a car." He made me promise. He told me a story, short, sunburned, honest, about nights in cheap motels and the way Thomas Rivera had scraped together change for a bus ticket to go look for work. He said he'd watched my car from the cameras and felt like a fool for not saying anything sooner, but that he'd been protecting me the only way he knew how, quietly. Then, he offered me the studio above his office. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled faintly of detergent and old paper, had a tiny sink and one window that looked over the alley where the delivery trucks idled, but it had 4 walls that were mine and a lock that only I would use. "It's an investment," he said, "in your stubbornness." There were conditions. Come to class, work the graveyard shifts, keep your grades up. But those were promises, not contracts. I remember standing there, clutching the strap of my backpack, feeling like someone had shoved a flashlight into a dark room. Relief didn't come as fireworks. It came as the slow, steady realization that maybe, I didn't have to sleep in my car anymore. I accepted, of course. I moved in the week the rent doubled. I left the Camry with its map of my small defeats and victories, parked it under a streetlight, and went upstairs to a place that smelled of Harold's toothpaste and the faint echo of people who kept their promises. The viral videos kept existing. They kept being mean. But the worst of the cold, the kind that sits in your bones at 3 a.m. when everything is noisy and nobody answers, started to thaw. They came for me first with accusations, like vultures deciding which part of carrion to argue over. One evening, 2 days after Harold had given me the studio, Maya and Colton showed up at the laundromat office with the kind of practiced moral outrage you can buy at a boutique. Colton's tie was the color of someone who never learned how to work a washing machine. Maya's eyes were red in a way I knew wasn't just for grief. They stood in the doorway and Colton said, loud enough for the night crew to hear, "We've heard things, Angelina. Don't think you're playing us for Harold's money." It felt like a throwback insult, like I was suddenly a character in a story they'd all agreed to pretend was true. I answered them the only way I could, by naming what had actually happened. I told Maya how she'd been absent, how the monthly transfers read like afterthoughts, how dinners turned into appointments, how being a daughter had become something you outsource. "You left," I said, and I said it with the rawness that comes from someone who's been counting the cost of being left. It landed between them like a pebble in a pond, small, accurate ripples that kept going. Maya blinked, then looked away. Colton smirked. which was when I realized the accusations were less about fact and more about cover. Ethan didn't watch the drama for long. He stepped out of the back room with a phone clenched in his hand and a face I'd never seen on him before. Young, furious, like someone who just discovered a family-size betrayal. He'd been snooping on Rita's laptop, he said, because he'd been looking for a homework file and had found a string of messages instead. Messages between Rita and Colton. Sweet, flirty, ridiculous in the way infidelity tries to pretend that it isn't theft. Then the texts shifted. Spreadsheets, account numbers, a shell company name, phrases like, move the wiring on Monday, and we'll be gone before this party. There were PDFs attached, bank exports showing transfers that had been rerouted, invoices for consulting fees that paid for nothing but offshore accounts. The number that made my stomach drop was a line item that added up to more than $4 million. For a beat, the world narrowed to the tiny rectangle of light on Ethan's phone. Rita, who'd always been pious in the way people who like to be in charge of other people are, was suddenly a woman who wrote, "We'll be free in 2 weeks," at 3 a.m. Colton, who'd moved into our life with blueprints and a smile, was suddenly the kind of crooked you only saw in courtroom dramas. The room smelled like bleach, but instead of cleaning it, felt like it was sterilizing a crime scene. Claire found out the way good people do, slow and sickened. She came to me the next morning with her hair in a mess and mascara tracks that looked new. We sat on the tiny couch in my studio and she said, "I'm sorry." Not the casual, "Oh, my bad," but the kind of sorry that folds into itself and becomes action. She told me she'd been complicit in small cruelties toward me, that she'd laughed at videos she shouldn't have, that she'd learned to love the sound of other people's shame. Then she moved in with me that afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic embrace, so much as two people aligning like gears. She brought a suitcase and an apology and a genuine willingness to be less terrible. That admission mattered. It changed the trajectory of things. Harold did what Harold does. He kept his temper like a tool he could take out when necessary. He called his lawyer and, with trembling hands that betrayed nothing, told him everything. He'd been watching the books for years, more carefully than one would expect for a man who liked to hum while he worked. And there were anomalies. Transfers to companies that didn't exist, invoices with the same handwriting as Rita's stationery, payroll shifts that seemed invented. He'd kept the security footage, the bank statements, the ledgers. The FBI has a way of moving quietly until they're not quiet at all. They asked Harold what he wanted, and he said he wanted the truth. The sting was set for Ethan's 18th birthday, because life has a taste for irony. The party was a backyard thing. Balloons, a cake with "finally legal" scrawled in frosting, the sort of cheap, earnest decor that teenagers think is tasteful. Rita walked in with the pride of someone who thought everything was under control. Colton had that posture men adopt when they've spent too long convincing themselves they're untouchable. They were cheerful, rehearsed, dangerous. At a prearranged moment, two men in suits came up the driveway, agents, calm and ordinary, and asked if they could speak to Rita privately. People clapped because they thought it was part of a surprise. Some filmed because that's what cameras are for at parties now. Then the house that had been built on polite smiles and ledger lines became a stage. They read rights out loud like lines in a play. Rita's face emptied into a kind of stunned disbelief that would have been tragic if it hadn't been so precise. Colton tried to laugh it off. He tried to say it was a mistake. The agents didn't smile. Someone cracked a joke about the timing. Ethan's face was bright and glossy, alive with a terrible, immediate understanding, and then the cuffs closed. I felt something unmoored fall out of me in that moment. Fear, yes, but also a fierce, hot relief, watching them led away under the same string of party lights that had once dangled like promise, felt like watching rusted tools finally be taken out of the hands of people who used them to hurt you. They were charged with wire fraud and embezzlement. The papers used big words that tried to make the theft sound like a ledger entry in a bad spreadsheet. Harold's lawyers moved fast, and the evidence, so thorough it made my head spin, made the prosecutor's case sound like a list anyone could understand. Intent, movement of funds, planning. Rita and Colton were taken into custody that night. The neighbors would talk about it for weeks. The videos of the arrest would go up and down the feeds like a storm. I tried not to look at those clips. The last thing on my mind was how my mother would look in the morning light when she realized the life she'd signed up for had unraveled at her feet. Afterwards, the family that had existed around me, because blood had made it so, which is to say, because we all pretended, shifted. Ethan was quiet until he wasn't. He moved back into his room with a new humility that wasn't performative. Claire, who had moved into my studio with a suitcase and guilt, started coming in early to sweep the folding tables and learning the register, fumbling with coin rolls like she was learning patience. Harold sat me down one night and said simply, "We'll do it right. We'll rebuild it right." He didn't make promises in the old way. He made plans. There was no cinematic revenge, no grand speech about poetic justice. But there was exposure and consequence, and the people who'd tried to erase me found themselves the ones erased from the ledger. For the first time in a long while, I slept without the dashboard clock watching me like a judge. After the cuffs clicked shut and the lights in their house dimmed for the last time, the fallout was the slow, honest kind. Not fireworks, but a whole lot of paperwork and awkward breakfasts. Rita and Colton were gone in the way toxic things finally leave when someone else clears them out. Immediate, irrevocable, and somehow quieter than I expected. There were court dates, seized accounts, and a lot of lawyers who said things like restitution and recovery, while Harold translated all of it into plain language for me. We weren't rich, but we weren't penniless either. That number on Ethan's phone that once felt like a threat turned into a tool we could use to fix what had been broken. Ethan and Claire moved in with me. One couch, 2 duffel bags, and a mutual sense of shame that quickly turned into something more useful. Accountability. Claire started showing up early at the laundromat, sleeves rolled up, asking Harold where she could help. She learned the register by making mistakes and apologizing properly. She learned how to fold towels so they looked like small, respectable rectangles, and how to look someone in the eye when they left their card and tipped in quarters. Ethan found the mechanical heart of the place, the washers and dryers, and got his hands greasy in a way that felt humiliating at first and then oddly sacred. He learned to change a belt, to read a gauge, and to be surprised when a customer came back and said thank you because service had dignity in it now. We treated the studio like a little patch of reformation. Rent was fair. Harold made sure none of us were paying the kind of debt that humiliated, and every month when the bills were paid, we had a small ritual. Pancakes in a pan that used to belong to my dad. It was stupid and domestic, and exactly the kind of ordinary that stitches people back together. Claire would pour syrup with a concentration that looked holy. Ethan would joke about finally being useful, and Harold would smile the way he does when a machine hums the right tune. Maya went to rehab. Saying it like that makes it sound neat, and it wasn't. There were denials and relapses and nights when I wondered whether my capacity for forgiveness had a limit. She stayed in treatment long enough to look at what she'd done and long enough to start saying things that were honest. We didn't leap back into a mother-daughter sitcom. Instead, we built something narrower and truer. Visits that weren't performances, phone calls that weren't excuses, and slowly and attending to the things she'd neglected. She apologized without theatrics, which was new and better. Harold took us under his wing with a kind of stubborn patience. He taught us the ledger like a religion, and the ledger taught us how people behave when they're trusted and when they're not. He insisted we learn every job at the shop, tending machines, balancing the books, talking to customers. If you run it, he'd say, you'll know why to protect it. His plan wasn't to hand us a crown, it was to hand us competence. We took to that like refugees to a map. Now I manage the laundromat. My title is ordinary, manager, but the work is anything but. I schedule shifts, hire people who need a second chance, set up a fund for nights when someone has no coins, and host a weekly community wash for people who live in cars or shelter and don't have quarters to spare. I set the playlist, and sometimes I let the teenagers choose something appallingly loud because they need to be loud sometimes. Claire runs the front, Ethan runs maintenance. Harold sits in the office and tells stories that are always just the right blend of hard and kind. There are days I miss the idea of my old family, the way you miss a house you used to live in. Familiar, full of ghosts, useful in its own way. There are other days, more and more, where I feel the quiet pleasure of being needed for the right things. The laundromat hums. People come and leave with clean clothes and sometimes cleaner futures. I make coffee the way Dad liked it sometimes, and it tastes like proof. Loss didn't end me. It redirected me. I lost a family and found one that showed up. That's not a tidy moral so much as a fact I can live with. I'm Angelina. I fold towels, balance spreadsheets, and sleep without the dashboard clock watching me like a judge. The work is honest. The people are messy and real. The future is mine to earn, and for now, that is enough.